Okay, good morning. This is John Hutnick from Tontiktong University, and this is a review of the course of social anthropology. And I thought what I do in this makeup session is work through a recent article that I've written and talk about that in the context of the things we were talking about in the course. So I've got my coffee and I'm in a cafe and it's all ready to go. And yeah, the course is 302.113. It's going through a rename at present, so it's going to be changed to 302.118 and be called social anthropology, but that's by the by. And the article I'm talking about, I've just published. Okay, it's one in tourism studies, I guess, but it's from an anthropological perspective. Studying tourism means going to have a look for yourself, co-research vulnerabilities and opportunities after the pandemic. And this is a published article now in Tourism Recreation Research, which is in a special issue put together over the last few months and about to come out in, I suppose, about a month's time. It's an issue in honour of Keith Hollingshead, who passed away last year. And Shalini Singh, the editor who's taken on the task, is a bit of a tribute to Keith Hollingshead, whose work some people read during the course. I've been giving it out. And I've read quite a lot of him, been in touch with him, and he's sadly missed. Yeah, he passed away about a year ago now. And yeah, his work for this special issue had been significant, really pushed all the different authors to address this issue of vulnerabilities and opportunities in tourism studies. And he was also someone who knew Malcolm Crick, and I thought I would write about Malcolm Crick, who was my teacher. So I talked about this in terms of his work, Malcolm Crick's work, and the core point in the course actually was taken also from Malcolm Crick, the idea that anthropology was really about going to have a look for yourself, and going to have a look for yourself being a code for field work, and also, I suppose, not trusting anyone, even your own eyes, I suppose, in terms of reflexivity and so on. Of course, going to have a look for yourself and do field work in the context of the pandemic, which everyone experienced in the last couple of years, is an important factor. So I wanted to think about that as well, and was encouraged to think about that by Keith. So the writing of this article was more than a year ago, but it did feed into the discussions in the course. The key point, I suppose, is where to start with. Tourism studies can't rely upon studies of tourism to cover its range. So the anthropology of tourism once had a kind of bit of a revival, or had a frisson of excitement, let's say, with an anthropological insert into that in probably the 70s and 80s or the 80s, especially around Malcolm's work, where he was quite provocatively suggesting that, you know, anthropologists were just tourists, or tourists of a kind of nuanced, slightly higher status, in that they get tricked and trapped by tourist brochures and tourist touts, travel guides in local situations that are kind of more longer term or a different level. I don't know whether that's really true, but certainly increasingly anthropology has become a little bit faster. Quite a lot of anthropological consultancies where fieldwork will be, you know, even a matter of weeks in some cases. But the old style fieldwork still is pretty much there. So in this context, we wanted to think about what vulnerabilities and opportunities were there in thinking about this old debate about whether tourists and anthropologists were similar or not, how they were different. And of course, in the context of what happened with COVID-19. especially to the tourism economy, and in Vietnam, where I am, where we are in this course, because the effects of the pandemic on tourism, not especially on tourism, but very, very well, more on tourism than other industries, was severe. Okay, so in part, part of the issue or the fear in the early months of the pandemic was that, you know, travel spread the disease. All right, so if you remember in Vietnam, the issue was the arrival of the COVID-19 through the activities of was a pilot who went night clubbing or something, and that spread the virus. And so there was a direct link made between travel, international travel, and tourism. So that was an issue that had to be discussed and was part of the context. Of course, the full stop that was put on international travel and eventually domestic travel with lockdown in Vietnam basically froze the tourism sector, and that's going to obviously have significant effects. People lost their jobs, businesses went closed for lockdown, or had no customers. International tourism dropped from something like 18, 19 million per year to next to none, and for nearly 2 years, and have still not recovered completely. And we'll look at some statistics in a minute. And yeah, the impact on not just workers in the tourism sector, though many of them lost their jobs, but also flow on to other sectors like the building industry, which of course means building hotels is a large part of it was affected. And there were other industries, catering, services, transport, you know, restaurants, nightclubs, and so on, all suffered somewhat from the lockdown. First of all, the international tourism and in fact the domestic tourism. There was the fantastic slogan for domestic tourism to try and replace or inspire the domestic tourists to take up the slack that was lost in the economy from the lack of international tourists, which was Nuôi Việt đi du lịch Vietnam. It means to visit Vietnam. Quite clever slogan. Although domestic tourism was never going to replace, even though it's increased, never going to replace the amount of income generated by having international tourists who bring, you know, for every one international tourist, there's $10 spent to every $1 of domestic tourism, no matter how many. I think the domestic numbers are something like 90 million now, so 5 times the amount of 80 million, something like that, 5 times the amount of international tourists, even at the height, and yet international tourism still has a greater economic impact and flow-on impact to other industries. Anyway, wanting to think about who was affected by tourism and think about how fieldwork and anthropology and tourism were possibly similar. One suggestion that I was making in this article was that we could rethink tourism as an opportunity to rethink fieldwork, rethink who it is that does fieldwork. And my suggestion is that tourists should be doing study in a vulnerable world, in a world where we really need to rethink all of the processes in which the industry and the economy and the environment are involved. The idea of study itself suggests itself as a possibility and a vulnerability in some ways. So this is the article, and it was a kind of hopeful, naive attempt to rethink tourism and anthropology together. So it's Malcolm Crick's idea. Here's a picture of his book, Resplendent Sights, Discordant Voices, Sri Lankans and International Tourism. And that's his book on doing fieldwork in Sri Lanka. He did 7 months fieldwork in Sri Lanka. Not the usual year that, at least a year that anthropologists are asked to do tourism, to do fieldwork in the Malinowskian tradition, which is more than 100 years old, but still is used as a kind of rite of passage for anthropologists to get their credentials. But Crick's credo, mentioned in his lectures all the time at the time of his writing this book and before, of going to have a look for yourself, was the cry, I suppose, and the code for my course. So that's quite important to me, the idea of going to have a look for yourself, although of course you should also not trust what you see or what people tell you to see. But yeah, there's something in it. So the other thing is that there was this opportunity afforded by the collapse of tourism under the pandemic to really rethink what the tourism sector is about. So 2 years of suspension of international travel. It's worth thinking about what that meant. I mean, at the first part of the pandemic, people were they've been really thinking interesting things about it, I thought. Talking about how there were no planes, there were no streams of markers of planes flying in the sky. There was actually less pollution in the air in the city. But then people started to see there was also less jobs, certainly in tourism sector. Some places, I visited one place in Kanto, for example, where of the 42 staff, there were only 2 staff left working. Skeleton crew was left. And the effect of that, both in that workplace and the local economy, is obviously massive. And yeah, people had to go and find other work. Problem with the tourism sector is a lot of people are in precarious work. It's not as well set up in terms of social security and contracts and so on. People were easily let go. A lot of people were casual workers, part-time workers, or on-call workers, and they had to seek other jobs. And often, quite a lot of them moved into the new jobs that were emerging because of COVID, like shipping, shippers, so-called shippers, grab delivery and so on, food delivery. But of course, those opportunities weren't enough to cover everyone from that huge sector of the economy. Anyway, the fact that tourism stopped was an opportunity to really rethink what the tourism economy was about. And it's interesting that became a discussion within tourism studies. So it became a discussion actually a bit late. Perhaps people started to think about it when, especially when there was talk of the rebooting or the restart of the economy, and the economy, tourism economy especially. Its recovery from COVID was slow. Slow recovery. We can look at some stats that'll show that as well. But at the time of that slow recovery, some people in tourism studies started to say, well, here's a chance to really rethink things. Whether they did rethink, whether that rethinking went on within the industry or just in a small section of tourism studies is an issue, perhaps. The statistics. If you look at this, right? We only have, this is the General Statistics Office, so the Vietnamese government. We only have up to, still on the website now, you only have to the first part of 2021. So before the recovery isn't there, but the numbers are pretty revealing. 18 million international visitors in 2019 drops to just 3 million. Remember, the first month of 2020 was involved there. And in just 150, not even 200,000 in 2021. I think the number for 2021 got up to about well, quite a bit more than that. That was the early part of 2021. But it's still only now, apparently, around 4 or 5 million. So well down the numbers of 2019. You can look at some other. Well, here's the numbers for January 2023. See, this is foreigners, international arrivals in Vietnam by plane, 800,000, so nearly a million. Forget the numbers about how much higher. It's higher than last year. So, but last year was next to nothing. So those percentages increase are absurd. So in a month, 871 in January, right? So you've got to multiply that by a factor of 12 and probably increasing. Maybe the figures for 2023 will get to 12 million apps. A big factor will be where they come from and whether or not Chinese and Russian tourists, who are a large percentage of the 18 million in 2019, will return. For obvious reasons, there are different factors at play here. China hadn't opened to travel until recently, and the war in the Ukraine has made it a bit of an issue for Russian tourists. There's one more graph, I think. That one. No. But I had 3 graphs, sorry. I've got 2. You see they distinguish in the graph, this is infograph from the General Statistics Office. They distinguish between arrivals by plane, by road, and by sea. But those road and maritime arrivals are very small for international tourists. For domestic tourists, I haven't seen a statistic, but I imagine they're quite different. There's still a lot of domestic tourists travel by plane, as you see the success of flights between Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi. Okay. So we're talking about a suspension of tourism for a while and what that affected. And we see the numbers. The numbers were a complete collapse of student arrivals and a slow recovery. So it's a stalled recovery, and some people have been saying, not just in Vietnam, other places as well, affected by things like visa regulations and when places opened, and and having flow-on effects to other industries. It's very interesting to think about how this affects the building industry, given how many hotels are being built. For example, on the Ho Tram Strip, on the southern coast of Vietnam. A lot of new hotel developments, and a lot of them geared towards casino, so-called casino tourism, and so towards the Chinese market. That'll, I think, be a big factor, whether the Chinese tourists want to come to beachside resorts to gamble, which it seems, and given the studies that were done to anticipate it, it seems they will, but so far they hadn't arrived. And in my picture, you'll see, next one, here, the beach is ready for them. This is outside one of the casinos, completely empty. And Cave and Dredge are one of the tourism studies people who are thinking about it. This is an opportunity to rethink what tourism studies should be about. Not just market research, but also thinking about the effects of the market. And for me, the wider flow-on effects of something that impacts tourism also impacts building, impacts catering, impacts other services. Everything from restaurants to prostitution or nightclubs, or and the ecology, the environment. Yeah, this photo maybe is a bit interesting because if you see the one person in the photo, He's a security guard taking a photograph of me taking the photograph. This kind of little mise scene, which is fun. Yeah, okay. Enough of that. So the pandemic changed much, and I guess in tourism studies, inspired by having a look for yourself, the question that needs to be taken up by scholars um, is who gets to look? Who is it that gets to have a look at this stuff? Because um, in a lockdown, people can't necessarily go and have a look for themselves. After the lockdown, there's a lot of energy in rebooting tourism, I suppose. Uh, is it a rush to get back to how things were, business as usual, back to the new normal or normal? Or is it an opportunity to renew and refocus what's involved in tourism research? I guess it's what I wanted to think about, inspired by Malcolm Crick, because way back in 1985, he had pointed out that the subject position or the identities of a host, a guest in tourism, the classic dyad of host and guest, and then the researcher who interprets those relationships is up for reconsideration, because he provocatively, he intended to be provocative, wanted to suggest that there was similarity between anthropologists, tourists, and tourists. In fact, hippies and ethnographers were somehow interchangeable. And he meant it as a joke, he meant it as a provocation, but he also meant it very seriously in a kind of wry or ludic, ironic way. And that's the key point, is making a provocative suggestion to get us to think something new and something different about tourism. And that's why he was great. He was also a bit weird, lecturing with his eyes closed behind some quite thick glasses and so on, almost as if he's reading the text on the inside of his eyelids. But he was thinking as he spoke, I suppose, and he was trying to get us to also think as we do. So taking him seriously, and that's the key point. If anthropologists are only sort of like tourists, as consensus became, the more interesting thing might be to turn this around and say, what is it that, could you make a case for tourists to be more like anthropologists? Because if anthropologists were to think about themselves as if they were tourists, well, why not up the stakes or improve the criteria and think about tourists being anthropologists? Because tourists, right, do study. But, anthropology in Vietnam is not that well known, I suppose, or it is known, but it's not as prominent. And its contemporary manifestation still remains very ethnographic in the old sense. And so new anthropology is something we've talked about in the course a lot. And by new anthropology, I don't mean really brand new or anything. It's some things that have been going on here for a while, but going on elsewhere, but maybe a little less stressed in conventions of reputation of anthropology. Digital ethnography, media ethnography, questions about identity and sexualities and intersectionality and so on. We covered a lot of these things with work, Sarah Pink and David Graeber and so on. But I also think it's important to go back to versions of anthropology that maybe have gone out of favor elsewhere, that have some credence or some ballast, some solidity here, like Marxist anthropology and anthropology of industry. And the proposal I've been making is that everyone in the industry, tourists, hosts, anthropologists, market researchers, could be rethinking what's missing from the anthropology of tourism and how that also needs a reboot along with the reboot of the tourism economy as such. So this is maybe a bit of a stretch to think of reconfiguring tourism as study. That's study as a kind of way of being is the idea. I take it from Fred Moten and Stefano Hani's book, which we talked about in the course. And the main idea is that researchers involved in any project or study should include those who are best placed to have insights into what is going on in any situation by dint of being directly involved in that situation. That's really a key point that comes from talking with Crick back in the day, but also draws on a tradition that we talked about in the course, co-research and collaborative research or participatory research. By participatory research in tourism, I don't mean having tourists participate in the research by being questioned by a researcher, but becoming the researchers themselves. A bit of a challenge involved in that. The thing is, tourists, they already study. They study to an extent. They do their homework and choosing a holiday destination, deciding upon all the different options, going through the travel guides, looking at their different brochures and locations and planning their budgets and checking out the prices and you know, constrained by certain factors, practicalities of planning a holiday. And also what information is available, often limited information about resorts and quality of service, and they have a reliance on already existing brochures and maybe the imaginative aspect of anthropology is not there in the study that tourists do, although no doubt some tourists choose their destinations according to what they've read in anthropology classes. So perhaps there's or at least exoticized versions of culture in that sense. But generally, maybe a travel guide is not a ethnography. Even the Lonely Planet of India's travel survival kit, you see the picture there, we talked about in detail. It says a lot about Indian culture, but sometimes in very stereotyped ways that anthropologists cringe at, but then many tourists cringe at as well, feel uncomfortable about. You think it's not like that at all. What you read in Lonely Planet was often not what really happened. But yeah, what if tourism can be reconfigured as study? Now, study tours have a bit of a history. I showed you a picture of the Baedeker guidebooks before. It was the grand tour in those days, part of the education of British aristocracy and women with chaperones a bit later. Though this later became the American Peace Corps, started with John F. Kennedy. And study tours is a thing. I mean, led by Rotary clubs or development or charity NGOs or universities or anthropologists or leftist political groups would go on study tours to the Soviet Union or Cuba, constituting a small but significant component of international travel. Now, maybe this could be massively expanded in this article I've written, I wanted to think more about how the ethos of project-based tourism and solidarity study tours could entail a rethinking. In such tours, well-intentioned visitors replicate good works and volunteer tourism. They dig wells in the desert that's a somewhat cliche version. Where for a fee, young Australians, Americans, British and Canadians, among others of course, do development or charity work that ostensibly contributes to local well-being. You won't be surprised that I'm very critical of charity work. I think the classic anthropological thing here is charity is a kind of gift, and a gift is never really a gift. There's always a payback. Even if it's anonymously given, the giver feels good and gets a reward. So nonetheless, there's a substantial segment of tourism and the critique of such programs It's well established, and it's something we could explore. So for international and for domestic tourists in Vietnam, the options of volunteer programs continue to expand. International volunteering often involves work share, educational environmental themes, and domestic travel also is involved. Built into structures, actually. You'll know better than I do about Green Summer, for example, 3T's program. These are on the spectrum of at one level religious charity, at the other level contribution to the community by the members of the community. And that whole area of doing work with others can be brought up alongside tourism to think about what tourism would be if it was reconfigured as study tours, which is study tours though, but as thinking tourism. So if we imagine tourism reconfigured as study tours, perhaps it involves, I don't know what, a lot of Americans come for Agent Orange cleanup, dioxin and toxins. There's one team that comes and does a tour, which is canal dredging in Anyang. There's built-in environmental homestays, Green Summer, as I mentioned. We could reconsider how solidarity tourism may be the grounds for greater conviviality in tourism, greater connection, greater participatory and responsible tourism. But of course, that's also a function of privilege that allows charity tourism, and the tourist intent in doing something good, anything good works is only a privilege, and there's a range of choices, and some of them are self-serving, and some of them are perhaps selfless. So I always wonder. It's critiqued as self-serving. The advantage that accrues through privilege needs to be redistributed, and how one thinks about that, how one studies that, could be an issue, especially in the context of solidarity, in order to maybe make more mainstream environmental issues, bring publicity to locally led causes that might be a contribution. These possibilities that need a lot of rethinking, a lot of thinking, and maybe rebooting. It would not be ideal to have some kind of new Peace Corps or something like that. Even critiques to be made of all of these programs. Yet the idea of tourists who are right there at the coalface, and the people who work in the sector, whether it be the tourism sector or adjacent sectors like building and catering, so on, having a say in generating knowledge about tourism seems really relevant. So this can fit in with other big programs, like in the Delta, the master plan, Mekong. The Delta has a lot of tourist visitors. They come, the length of international tourist stay, I read somewhere, I saw some statistical work on this, is usually a day, so that doesn't include study tours. People get to Ho Chi Minh City, they go on a day trip to the Delta and come back. That's the majority of them, but some people stay for longer. And whether they're informed about the crisis and the issues and the concerns, salination, flooding, drought, the effect of upstream dam, all sorts of issues that this information about the Mekong Delta Plan canvases is up for grabs, and there's plenty that could be studied there. Certainly plenty of reasons for tourists to spend more than a day, and to spend more than a day reading about where they're going before they go there. Seems like a no-brainer to me that that's an area for growth, but we'll see. Of course, tourism as usual might be just heading to the beach. That's fine too, but which beach? You're going to go to Condal. There's different reasons for going there, for example. So the unfolding hydraulic of the Mekong area is, the Vietnam government's Delta Plan is maybe a basis for exploring how tourism among the communities of the Mekong could be reconfigured as study, and making study tours and the work of solidarity collaborative, equity-focused, redistributive, and participatory in a real sense. Now, this is a factor where participatory methods participatory methods actually is a challenge to how anthropology is set up, as anthropologists usually should have done field work as part of their PhD. That rite of passage we talked about at the start, the Malinowski style 1 year in a tent kind of field work. That's a kind of credentialism. And what are the credentials of those who are participating in research if they don't have a already credentialized researcher, so co-research, holding their hand, so to speak? The challenge here is to really rethink what makes one a researcher. And we've talked a lot about everyone as a researcher, students as researchers from day one. But I think anyone who participates in the tourism economy, whether as a tourist or as a service provider, as a worker in the tourism industry, has already done some study, knows what the circumstances are, and can do more study. And maybe they are the ones that should have the credentials to be the ones producing knowledge that goes into journals, goes into libraries, that goes into not just in a passive kind of review kind of way. And this is a big factor in terms of the new digital forms of travel guide, like TripAdvisor, which relies very much on participants in the tourism economy providing the content, doing the reviews, usually short reviews, and it's aggregated by how many stars you give a place. But that could be massively expanded to scale up to the level of geographic research. And that's a important part of the questioning of how methods in the university and who gets to study and who gets paid to study are problematic issues, because redistribution of the wealth of the university and the wealth of the globe actually will question who gets funded to produce knowledge about situations where it's local workers that know what's going on, but it's credentialed ethnographers who parachute in, like tourists, for weeks or a year, who get to write books about it or articles about it. And this imbalance in the economy is something we continually strive to have to think about. That international tourists bring 10 times the revenue of domestic tourists. Domestic tourism is 10 times the size. Now let's think about that in terms of who's studying, who's producing knowledge, and how that knowledge is entering into the record. And I don't mean just the record of TripAdvisor or one of those apps, but the record of all human knowledge should be a factor. So here's an article looking at the prospects for reconfiguring tourism as an expanded mode of study beyond the educational study tour and its possibilities. Well, I'll talk a bit about issues then that might be studied in more detail. One is pollution, marine environments, habitats, the delta again, water quality, food quality, geological damage, toxins. There are so many things that it seems to me that tourists and the tourism industry and adjacent industries could study, need to take account, and we don't have sufficient knowledge about them as yet, or what knowledge we have is in obscure books and needs to be studied as well by everyone. Yeah, I think there's some of this is coming out, especially recently, books about dioxin and pollutants. If anyone wants to get in touch, there's a new book I've been reading recently on farmers and dioxins in Queenong area uh, by a scholar from Hawaii who's really interesting. Vu, her name is Vu, Chi Vu. Yeah, just email me for a copy of her connection for that reference. There are also lots of studies now about erosion and the effect of rising seawater on the delta. Okay, and we even have sci-fi movies that seem to at least indirectly reference this. And you can see from the image what I have in mind, how much that film, Avatar: Way of Water, was about Vietnam. It's quite uncanny, but by the by. Oh, this is out of order. I think this is Green Summer. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. But Green Summer is another kind of set of issues and addressing this forms and varieties of study tour that I think is very interesting and also needs to be studied in itself for the people involved. I think this is the psychology department of University of Psychology, I think. And yeah, another picture from Avatar that quotes Apocalypse Now's publicity poster. By the by, maybe it's naive to think that tourists will want to study, or that hosts will want to have them interfering, or that hosts will want to study. But it is really possible. It's not just possible to think that not all tourists will want to follow the same beaten track and just head to the beach and get sunburned. Right? There will be some who will be keen to do something else. Not all will be suited to self-sacrificing their holiday time in some honest work in disregard of ego and appreciation. They prefer tanning, but not all tourism should be the same. We'll easily agree that. But these are not unprecedented suggestions. They're not unanticipated problems. Nothing that radical in this. But trying to establish continuity and credibility for study tours, despite the easy criticisms of study tourism and creative tourism, in broad definition, the sustainable small-scale tourism that provides a genuine visitor experience. I mean, that also makes me cringe a little, but it's on the way. Immersion in local culture, sort of, yeah, well, tourism, anthropology, they're on the spectrum, so to speak. But it's all learning, and if everyone were involved in study, there might be possibilities there. And it's not like mass tourism can be simply replaced by some sort of evangelical pedestrian global walking cure. But one thing that I think is really interesting is the walking tours. And most big cities have these, and other places have walking tours that historical walks or educational walks that are a bit like study tours as well, where domestic or expat internationals visit places of culture to learn and improve themselves. There's Stephen Muki and Jennifer Eddy's article that was in the Tondokan Conference of 2019 and published in Educational Philosophy and Theory. Here you can see the link. I can send you the article if you email me. Talks about Aboriginal walking tours, heritage trails in Australia. And that's a big thing about people learning country and taking respect and immersion in culture and learning about the atrocities of how that culture has been persecuted for a couple of hundred years by colonization is obviously, I think, important, crucial. These are some scenes from the heritage tour, coastal Western Australia, in fact. And some tourists climbing on rocks. I mean, Hardly. It's tourism proper, right? But they're also on this heritage trail, learning Aboriginal heritage and putting back something to the economy, I guess, and getting something out of it for themselves. So going to have a look for yourself, as Malcolm Crick says. You know, if we don't do this, tourism studies will remain as market research, online, elitist, voyeuristic, you know, and that's a problem. It needs to be challenged. So we need to, I think, recruit those who've been impacted and affected by the ongoing crisis, any crisis. The crisis of the pandemic, but any crisis, to always rethink the situation as study. It's just a useful metaphor or trope or frame to do better than we usually do. And to not allow this to happen from outside. Market research comes from outside. It's not the participants who are doing market research. They're getting specialists to come and market research for them. And why do we need to do that? Why can't the people who best know the situation be the one that do the research? That needs some institutional change, right? But it's possible. So tourism studies could perhaps unravel something somewhat to let go of some of the market research aspects that frankly dominate, and be more focused on different sectors together. Get involved in collective writing with hosts and guests, and be reflexive and dialectical and collaborative, and find inspiration in renewing tourism studies in this period. It might be a utopian idea, but the opportunity was going to be lost if the whole of the pandemic just becomes something we recovered from and we got back to normal. There's more that can be done than that. So the idea is utopian virtue, everyone studying everything, everywhere, all the time. Yeah. Okay, thanks. I'll stop for a minute.